This presentation is about McCarthyism and the Crucible. McCarthyism was an overzealous anti-communist witch hunt which took place after World War II, when many people were afraid that communism would take over the US. But McCarthyism took it to the extreme. Many people were falsely accused, and most of the people who were questioned were asked to name names, which caused many more false accusations. And this movement was named after Senator Joseph McCarthy because he made a speech saying he had a list in his hand of US government officials who had turned communist. Now, it was just like in the Crucible, a witch hunt, where people, because they were afraid and during questioning, they falsely accused other people. After McCarthy and his scare, a committee was set up, and it was called the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC for short. And it was set up because it questioned accused communists and searched for names of others suspected. And it started in 1937, actually, this Un-American Activities Committee. While numerous industries were investigated by HUAC because of Hollywood's high profile, it became the best-known target of this infamous committee. Now, this committee had three different purposes in 1947. The first one was to prove that the Screenwriters Guild had communist members. The second purpose was to show that Hollywood writers were able to insert subversive propaganda into Hollywood films. And the third point was that J. Parnell Thomas, who was head of the committee, he argued that President Roosevelt had encouraged pro-Soviet films during the Cold War. And it's really amazing who were actually accused of being communist. And here we have some of the Americans. And one of them was, or two of them, very important actually. Both presidents, Roosevelt and Truman, were accused. And everybody who criticized McCarthyism were accused of being communist. And then lots of musicians, film stars, Hollywood writers and artists. And Ronald and Nancy Reagan as well. And then feminism seemed to also, it seems that feminism had problems as well, because lots of feminists and women leaders, movement leaders were accused. And atomic scientists, even the Girl Scouts, and as you see here, union leaders and Democrats in general. Democracy, or being a Democrat, because it was considered left-wing. Democrats had problems during McCarthyism. And here are lots of names of Hollywood writers and entertainers. You probably don't know all of these names, but if you go to the bottom of the list, you see Charlie Chaplin and Arthur Miller. And J. Parnell Thomas said, "It is only to be expected that communists would strive desperately to gain entry into the motion picture industry simply because the industry offers such a tremendous weapon for education and propaganda." And here are what is called the Hollywood 10. They were all accused of being members again. And when being accused, what you could do was to either deny involvement or to confess to their prior membership and be forced to name other members, or claim the Fifth Amendment. Now, the Fifth Amendment says that no one can be tried for a serious crime unless indicted or accused by a grand jury, and no one can be forced to testify against herself or himself, and no one can be punished without due process of law. Now, the Hollywood 10 are interesting because they actually denied to say anything in court. They refused to answer any questions, and then they were later found guilty of contempt of court. On the earlier slide, I forgot to say that Parnell, he was the chairman of HUAC. Now, I'll give you a few minutes to read this. Okay, now as you see at the bottom here, 320 artists were blacklisted, and a lot of actors' careers were actually destroyed. Let's go to Arthur Miller and look at what happened to him. 3 years after he wrote The Crucible, he was subpoenaed. That means he was called in. He got a court order to testify before the HUAC. And he's written a book called Time Bands, and here he wrote that they offered to cancel the hearings in exchange for his wife Marilyn Monroe, for her being photographed shaking hands with the chairman of HUAC. And of course Arthur Miller said no to this photo session. On February 19th, 1957, Arthur Miller was called in front of the federal grand jury. He was charged of contempt of Congress. He refused to name anybody in front of the HUAC committee. And he also said, "I have never been a communist." But he did acknowledge that he was involved in the past with a number of communist front groups. He testified that he was present at 5 or 6 meetings of communist authors in New York in 1947. But he is not a communist, he was never a communist, and he denied to name anybody. On this slide, we see the 2 questions that he was charged with, unlawfully refusing to answer. And the first question was, "Can you tell us who was there when you walked into the room? Was Arnaud Dussault chairman of this meeting of Communist Party writers, which took place in 1947, at which you were in attendance?" And here you see what Miller told the committee. "I will not support now a cause dominated by communists. My conscience will not permit me to use the name of another person and bring trouble to him. I speak my own sins. I cannot judge another. I have no tongue for it." So he did not name anybody. And you see, if you think about how everybody's naming everybody in his play, The Crucible, you see how much he really went against naming of others. And you can see the characters who actually do that in The Crucible. They're portrayed in a negative way. Just jump to the next slide. This one is not important. And let's go to some quotes from Miller in his essay that he published in the New Yorker called "Why I Wrote the Crucible." One of the things he said was, "To imagine writing a play about this environment was like trying to pick one's teeth with a ball of wool. I lacked the tools, yet I kept being drawn to it." Now, to pick one's teeth with a ball of wool is really, really impossible. So what he's saying here is that he lacked the tools to write this play. So he was sort of waiting until he knew exactly how to go about it, and because he was constantly drawn to the play. And then he continues by saying, I read about witchcraft trials in college, but not until I read a book published in 1996, a 2-volume, 1,000-page study by C. Upham, who was then the mayor of Salem. It was then that I knew I had to write about the period. And then The Crucible took me a year to write. Sorry, there's a spelling mistake here, but not until. There's only one L at the end of until. Sorry about that. And now the last page. Final quotes from the author. The unknowable is always around the corner. We know how much depends on mere trust and good faith, and how easily breached these are. And we know as well how weak we really are, and how quickly swept by fear the mass of us can become when our panic button is pushed. So he's talking about mass hysteria and how we should really, really fear it. Now you should note that Arthur Miller is Jewish, or was Jewish, and could also be a comment on what happened during the Second World War. And then finally here, the play reaffirms the ultimate power of courage and clarity of mind, whose ultimate fruit is liberty. So his message to everybody is that we should really have courage enough and to be clear-minded enough to say no to wrongdoings and to mass hysteria, and not name others. And that was all.